Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our remote audience as well as those in the room. This is a seminar of the Center for Media and Communication Research at HKBU School of Communication on a topic that is of maybe almost too much interest right now. I wish there was less things happening in this space, but a lot of people are interested in media freedom and censorship in Hong Kong, partly for wrong reasons. Still, it is good to be living in interesting times. Yeah? But in spite of all the discussion that takes place around this issue in Hong Kong and around the world, much of that discussion is ahistorical. It does not actually look back enough at even the recent past. And it's for this reason that it's a great pleasure that Michael has accepted our invitation to speak to us today. Michael is a professor at the law faculty of Hong Kong University. He is the author of this new book, Political Censorship in British Hong Kong, Freedom of Expression and the Law from 1842 to 1997. Up to the handover of Hong Kong back to China. He will, I'm sure, provide that much needed historical context in our discussions about Hong Kong censorship, and I'll pass the time over. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Should I use the mic for, yeah. Thanks very much for having me, Sharon. Thanks so much. We met a number of years ago, and it's really a great pleasure to be able to meet today. And this is my first time to the School of Communications of Hong Kong Baptist University. It's fascinating. I enjoy talking to your students and teachers. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very pleased to share with you some of my recent works on the topics of journalism and imperialism and colonialism and the relationship between them. Through my recent book published last year by Cambridge, Political Censorship in the British Hong Kong. So like many other research work, I start my research project or this project with a research questions. So let me move, yeah. Perhaps I can use these, yeah. Okay, not this picture yet. So the research question is basically, I think, concerns not only the freedom of speech, but also free press in general for the entire colonial period of Hong Kong. So the research question is basically, where did Hong Kong's freedom of speech come from, or free press come from? So it looks like apparently a very simple question for a lot of people, especially those born in or after 80s. You know, they might be saying, it's a simple question, it's not worth asking even. It's basically colonial rules. It's basically coming from English rule of laws principles for those studying laws or not, or it's basically coming from common law values, or just like some senior political scientists might advocate, it's basically a result of benevolent colonialism, okay, or a legacy of benevolent colonial rules. Hence, you know, I'm not saying it must be correct, but I think, you know, it's quite likely that that's why we saw so many people waving colonial flags in protest before 2020, with colonial flags, you know, indicating people are thinking the rule of law, freedoms, free press, or freedom of speech were better safeguarded during colonial times, which my research in this book disagrees. Okay, so this is the content of my book. I basically try to trace how the press, journalists, editors, or in general freedom of speech were tackled, but actually were pervasively censored during most of the colonial times, at least for 130 years, until the last 10 plus years before Hong Kong was returned to China, to rebut the so-called colonial nostalgia. So what I'm trying to argue is that the free press or freedom of speech that most of the Hong Kong people are so eager to preserve today did not come through the English legal system for most of the colonial times. It came because of the changing international relations between China and the world powers, and the world powers' China's strategies, and China's responses to those strategies. So as we can see, hopefully through this book. So this book is divided into 6 chapters. For the first 2 chapters, we focus very much on English press, although I'll talk much more about Chinese press as a topic of today. So it's about 19th century, it's an age, what I call the punitive censorship. And then from the beginning of 20th centuries, that means is into the 20th centuries with more people, more newspapers, more Chinese press, more Chinese journalists. Then Hong Kong turned from an age of punitive censorship to preemptive censorship. That will be covered by chapter 3, 4, and then into chapter 5, we do see a sign of liberation of Hong Kong for China. Okay, but why, I will let you know later. And then I'll conclude by hopefully I would be successful in terms of rebutting the nostalgic sentiments or misunderstanding of our legal past or misunderstanding of our freedoms that has been widely held, not only among the population of Hong Kong, but perhaps in the world. So I'm going to share with you within this in half an hour some of the archival materials that I've used. This book is entirely archival based. I basically used archival material, declassified correspondences between officials, archived in the National Archives in the UK at Kew Garden, beautiful place. Hong Kong Public Records Office located in Kwun Tong here. Also Singaporean National Archives, as well as Chinese and English newspapers, memoirs, etc. So this is newspapers reports of 1858, where it reported Mr. Murrow, who was the founder and chief editors of one of the most important mainstream English newspapers in 19th century, called Hong Kong Daily Press. He was prosecuted, fined, and imprisoned because his newspapers reported an incident where the Hong Kong government granted a contract to a trading company where the governor's son was a partner. So obviously undesirable. So obviously needed to be punished from the angles of the colonial government. So hence back then, during the 19th centuries, seditious libel was the main weapon to deal with undesirable newspaper reports or naughty editors or journalists. Hence, Murrow was fined and imprisoned. So not only reports against the governor or the government's ways of handling contracts will be targeted. Things that is more geopolitically sensitive will also be the target of censorship. So this is a secret correspondence from the Hong Kong governor to London asking for permissions to institute criminal proceedings, as you can see, to be taken against the editors of 4 Chinese newspapers. So some of which I think you know the name, Huaji Yebo, which is one of the mainstream Chinese newspapers back then. This is a mammal in the 1880s. So the second one is Chunwan Yebo. The third one is Zhongwei Shenbo. And the fourth one is Weishan Yebo, for publishing what purported to be an edict issued by the Viceroy of Guangdong and Guangxi, asking Chinese people in the mainland to resist against French people or to damage French armies. Why? As I said, I'll try to situate Hong Kong's history of freedoms, not only as a domestic history of a small city with less than 1 million of populations, but situate Hong Kong's history of freedoms as an important episode of global geopolitics or important episode of the history of international relations of China versus other world powers. So why the British colonial government was angry about things targeting on France, but not on London, not on colonial government in Hong Kong. So therefore, I would invite you, when reading my book, to situate the history of Hong Kong against the global histories. So 1880s, Sino-French War. So hence, it's not unusual for the Chinese government or Chinese government officials to make appeal to people to resist French aggressions. But from the colonial government point of view, from London's point of view, this is about Europeans' interests in China. So the colonial government did not want Hong Kong to be a base of anti-European sentiments. Hence, the spreading of this kind of sentiments and reports obviously against the grand strategies or geopolitical interests of the British government in Hong Kong. Hence, they would have to be prosecuted. So quickly into the 20s. So into the 20s, the situation is becoming more complicated for colonial Hong Kong government because number one, the collapse of Qing dynasty made a lot of influx of refugees in Hong Kong, booming up populations. At the same time, a lot of revolutionary newspapers not being allowed to be published or printed in China moved their office to Hong Kong to start their own press and newspapers. Therefore, a number of press in Hong Kong, in terms of Chinese language press, increased with the population. At the same time, the British government faced increasing legitimacy issues in Asia during or between the World War I and World War II, or during World War I. As you know, if you know Singaporean history, you know that Singaporean mutiny in the 1915, okay, the Indian mutinies, the Indian Garter movements also rose, tremendously during the interwar periods, not to mention the rise of communism, so which is basically targeted on imperialism in terms of the, what to act against. So therefore, into the 20s, so the colonial government in Hong Kong invented a number of draconian measures to supplement what I call the punitive censorship. They need to solve the problem in the bud. They need to solve the problem before the problem even became a problem. So therefore, a lot of invention, you say, in terms of political censorship of Chinese press. Number one, seditious publications ordinance. So this ordinance, actually was the ancestors of the current crimes ordinance, the seditious provisions, which, of course, scared most of the people in the field of journalism today. But it actually emerged in 1914 as an ordinance called Seditious Publications Ordinance, actually originally targeting Indian community, because it is for the purpose of stopping the inflow of Garter publications or independentist publications into Hong Kong that might incite Indian community in Hong Kong, especially those serving as policemen. So therefore, it was originally targeting Indian community, but at the same time is a very effective censorship weapon against the press. So you see all these, very familiar buzzword today, hatred or contempt His Majesty. So those are the things that, that has still remained a part of our crimes ordinance. Not only the law. Into the 20s, I think the colonial government facing tremendous pressure from the united front between Kuomintang and Chinese Communist parties in Guangzhou especially for inciting labor movements in Hong Kong with anti-imperialism targets. So therefore, in 1922, on the year of Seamen strikes, and then a number of years later, followed by the Canton Hong Kong strikes and boycotts, the colonial government, other than punitive censorship measures, other than the law, the colonial government was getting impatient. They would like to use executive actions to prevent anything from becoming a problem, rather than prosecute them using the law or libels lawsuits. So they invented Emergency Regulations Ordinance, which we all know now because it has been recycled in 2019 protests and recycled during the COVID for having you to wear masks, not wear masks, wear masks, not wear masks. So, but it was actually coming out from 1922 after the Seamen strike, in which there's one regulation, which is still in our statute book, saying that no person shall print, publish, distribute any newspapers, placard, pamphlet containing any matter in Chinese language. So that means it's only targeting Chinese press, which has not been previously submitted to and passed by the Secretary of Chinese Affairs. What does it mean? That means the law since then created a machinery for pre-vetting of any newspaper's roof. So I was very lucky. During my research, I found a personal connections of a gentleman called Ng Ba-ling, who was a very experienced and senior editor of Wakio Yatbo, who passed away in the 70s, who collected a bunch of his personal papers uncatalogued in a number of cartons stored in Hong Kong U Library special collections, where I found a government department which has never been discussed or discovered before, called 香港報紙檢查處, Hong Kong Newspapers Censorship Office or Vetting Office, which produce their operating hours in Chinese for the press to observe. So they open from Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., 8 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., and Saturday 2 to 4 p.m., 9 to 11 p.m., and then Sunday they open from 4 to 6, 8 to 1. So I always ask the questions to my audience of Book Talk, asking why they only open in the afternoon. But I'm sure, people in journalism schools know why they are not opening in the morning, because the morning time is for the people in the press to report, collect, and write news, and then they put together their layout, and then before they send to print, they have to send their final manuscripts to the government for vetting. So I found a lot of archival materials evidencing how the censors worked in the office. They basically read every pages, every line, to strike off using ball pen the words, the sentences, the reports that they didn't like, and return to the editors for printing overnight. So if you were the editors of a newspaper press, Chinese press back then, without the help of Microsoft Word, while some paragraphs being struck off, words being taken away, how would you rearrange the layout? There's no way that you can do that within a few hours before printing. So they found solutions. Filling the gap. This is the newspaper reports of newspapers sold in the street overnight. So by replacing those words disliked by government officials by placeholders like crosses, boxes, and dots, they succeeded, printing their newspapers without the help of Microsoft Word. It looks weird, but that's in Cantonese, 生活日常, the usual way of living of Hong Kong people from the 1920s all the way up to the early 50s. So if you want to read those newspaper reports with crosses, dots, and boxes, buy my book. You have a lot of image to enjoy. So I share with you one more. So for this reports, actually this is a report of the 1930s. As I said, you have to situate the history of freedoms of speech in Hong Kong against the global context, if not the regional, so that you can know what kind of words being deleted. If you know against the historical context, you would know that those being deleted are reference to Japan, Japanese, or Japanese people. So because of the ambiguous foreign policy of the British government towards Japanese aggressions in China, which the British government said they would maintain quote-unquote neutrality. So they didn't want Hong Kong to be a base of anti-Japanese sentiments. Okay, hence they would not like any reports, targeting Japanese to be appearing in the press. Hence the censorship, hence the political censorship. But sometimes it's very difficult for you to guess when a big part of it being taken away. So, if you want to, try, you can, get the book and then try to see whether you can fill in the blanks. But these newspaper reports tell me two things. Number one, not only single words, it could be a big paragraph being taken away taken away and replaced by boxes. Also, if you look at these newspaper reports, it's not the front pages. Obviously, it's the inside pages. Therefore, it's not only the most important headlines, the front pages being politically censored, but also the very small reports or inside pages will be read and censored by government censors at the so-called Hong Kong Newspaper Censorship Office. I think it's about Chinese, it's about Japanese aggressions in China. That's my rough guess, but I cannot accurately guess what it is because so much of it has been taken away. Sometimes, okay, it's not your homework, no worry. It's not your homework, you're being returned by your professors. So sometimes it's even more unfortunate that a journalist report written and then sent to the Hong Kong government censorship office being crossed out and returned entirely and banned from publications. This is a manuscript in the Ba Ling's personal collections, which contain a newspaper reports concerning the disputes between China and Russia over the rights to build railway, and that incited protests in Guangzhou. This report has been crossed out and returned. I found a number of these returned manuscripts, and one of which form the book cover of my book. And the most striking thing is not about the cross, it's about the chopped. So the chopped shows that the office is actually operating. It's not an empty law. So because the chop, the outer ring, it says 香港報紙檢查處 Hong Kong Newspaper Censorship Office. The inner circle said 此稿不得刊載. That means this manuscript is banned from publication. So I think it's fully evidenced the existence and the day-to-day operation of this office. So some people might say that, hey, you're using today's value to judge the past. Maybe in the past, the press is not concerned about the free press, is not concerned about freedom of speech. They're happy about that, so they just collaborated with the colonial government to be doing things like this. I would say no. So this is a newspaper report of 1936, which is about a Chinese legislative councillor called Lo Mengam, who was a lawyer by training, trained in London, who later became the legislative councillor, who was asked by editors of 50 Chinese newspapers to present a petition in the Legislative Council asking the Hong Kong colonial government to abolish this pre-vetting mechanism. So therefore, they knew it's bad. They knew is an emergency measure. They knew that it should be abolished. But of course, the Hong Kong colonial governments, just like many governments in the world, once being granted a power or emergency power, it will be continue to be used even during peacetime under the name of emergency. So hence, of course, the mechanism was not abolished. Not only the mechanism was not abolished, the most ironic thing is the Chinese newspapers reporting that petition or debate in the Legislative Council, that newspaper report was itself censored. So you can see that this is a newspaper report reporting that legislative debate, and a large part of it being replaced by ... So you can see how pervasive, how blatant, how under the broad daylight political censorship against the Chinese press could continue. So fast forwarding in the interest of time. So after World War II, Chinese government or new Chinese government was established. To the Hong Kong colonial government, of course, to a lot of Chinese people in Hong Kong, it could be a big news, sometimes happy news. But for colonial government in Hong Kong, it was a bad surprise, okay? Because actually Anglo-American camps was so surprised that Kuomintang lost the war. And to Hong Kong colonial government, it was extremely dangerous because overnight, Hong Kong was neighboring one of the biggest communist country in the world, which during the Cold War time, Yeah, the biggest. Yeah, I mean, if you include the Soviet. So okay, so therefore, during the Cold War time, that means you're neighboring your enemy. So not only that, because of the very soft border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, so there are basically not much restrictions for people coming to Hong Kong. Therefore, the Hong Kong colonial government suspected a lot of left-wing activists came to Hong Kong to set up newspapers, trade unions, schools. So the Hong Kong colonial government suddenly found that a lot more newspapers or journalists existing in Hong Kong when they were financially unable to continue the pre-vetting. Okay, because too many newspapers, too many reports, too shortage of manpower. So therefore, they invented a number of new laws to solve the problem. Before, as I said, they became a problem. They invented 3 very important laws that empower the Hong Kong government to detain, deport journalists, editors without trial, okay, for indefinite period. So they have the detention regulations, deportation ordinance, which continue all the way into the 80s. So a lot of victims, of course, were left-wing journalists, editors, including, of course, those usual suspects, editors, writers, journalists of 大公報、文匯報. They were deported overnight back to China. They were detained for indefinite period in Hong Kong. One of the detention centers still exists in Hong Kong. If you have chance, you should visit, which has now become the Hong Kong campus of University of Chicago in Victoria Road in the Western District. Luckily, they still retain the cell, the prisons. So it's open for visit. So went there to see where the political dissents were detained. Hence, many of the left-wing schools, principals, teachers, as well as Sima Mansam, who was one of the very famous writers of 文匯報, also the leaders of left-wing film writers in Hong Kong, who together with other people over the time from 50s to 60s were deported out of Hong Kong back to China without trial. So the only one who can decide whether these guys were to be deported or detained because they endanger Hong Kong safety or state security was the governor. Another very, very important law existing in Hong Kong from 50s to 80s that affected most of the journalists in Hong Kong, but never been talked about in any studies of journalism or the law, was a law called Control of Publications Ordinance. I'm not sure any one of you heard about that, but I'm sure Wang Yingxi, your distinguished alumni or supporters, or some of the very seniors alumni of your school could have heard about that, because I'm sure they have been under the pressure of this ordinance for a long period of time during their practice. Perhaps you could interview them. So the Control of Publications Ordinance empowered the Hong Kong government to shut down any press if they were suspected, as I said, suspected, without going through the open trial, suspected of publishing seditious headlines or seditious newspaper reports. So what amount to seditious? As we all know now, creating hatred, contempt, disaffections of governments or among people, they could be shut down. So the most famous shutting down of the press, of course, it happened in 67 riots, where 3 fringe left-wing newspapers being shut down by Hong Kong government, 田豐日報, 新晚報, etc. So these newspapers reporting policemen under the power of the Control of Publications Ordinance, holding shotguns, shutting down newspaper press, and then raiding their offices, arresting journalists and editors. So, but I've distressed that it's not only the left-wing journalists and editors were the victims of these censorship laws and measures. Also, the KMT-backed, Kuomintang-backed newspapers, although less often, but they could be subject to those measures as well. So this is Guokmen Yatpo, which was shut down by the Hong Kong government for publishing a newspaper reports reporting against the founder of Wakkyuyapo, and accusing him as the collaborators of Japanese army. I'm not sure how many of you know Wakkyuyapo was actually quite pro-government. So therefore, protecting friends and allies. So this Guokmenyapo was shut down for 1 month. Most of the time, Hong Kong government did not want to bring journalists and editors to court, not because they did not have the power to, but bringing those political dissents to court, as you may know in a few years' time, will give them platforms of political propaganda or exposing the ugly measures of the government. So therefore, the colonial Hong Kong government might not want to, unless forced to, bring those guys in court. But if they would like to teach other left wings or other political dissents a lesson, they would sometimes choose those leaders to be brought to the court and charge them under the Sedition Ordinance. So these are the editors and journalists being showcased in sedition trials in the 60s. So now in the 60s, we are going into the electronic media world. So the press or the newspaper press was not the only way that the population in Hong Kong enjoy news and entertainment. So we have RTHK, formed in the 20s, commercial radio formed in the late 50s. But I'm sure most of your teachers or former radio professionals teaching at a school know that actually from the 20s all the way up to the early 70s, radio can only broadcast news scripts produced by government information services. They had no right to collect news, write the newspaper reports, and to broadcast their news stories. They basically use unified news scripts obtained from Central, the Bacon Field building, right, where the government information services was located. They got the news scripts there and then broadcast to the radio. Hence, in the annual departmental reports of the government information services in the late 60s, it says that it had a radio newsroom which produced news bulletins for Radio Hong Kong, commercial radio, Rediffusion Television, and Hong Kong TVB. And that explains why, at the very beginning years of Hong Kong TVB did not hire journalists and news anchors to broadcast news. They used celebrities, Lau Ka-kiet, Zhu Wei-tek, who were not trained journalists, because it doesn't mean, it doesn't need to use journalists because everybody's reading the same news scripts. So why not use celebrities to attract more eyeballs? So all the way until early 70s, the Hong Kong government had strict controls of news being broadcasted. Not only the news. So this is a letter from the Nigel Ward, Director of Hong Kong Government Information Services, sending a letter to Commercial Radio Hong Kong, of course, located in Broadcast Drive, approving the applications of obtaining additional news scripts because they would like to increase their newscast. So the government replied, okay, I'll provide additional news scripts. That evidence the actual operations on the ground of this control of news broadcasts. Not only the news, this is even more interesting letter from a gentleman called Samuel Chen, who was the censored of the Hong Kong government, who wrote to the Secretary of Chinese Affairs, and then this memo was, at the end of the memo, forwarded to Controller of Broadcasting of RTHK. The content is that, he said, I have now had the opportunity to listen to and scrutinize all the gramophone records in RTHK. And then I found most of these, songs had no problem, except these 8, some of which I didn't know because it's not in Chinese language. But one I want to point out is a song called Mun Gong Hong, Man Jiang Hong. Is a Song Dynasty heroic song, which he said, although it's not directly relating to politics of Hong Kong, but if it's misinterpreted, it might create a problem. So he would suggest this not to be included in the gramophone playlist of RTHK. So this is something revealing to me. That means that not only the news being controlled, actually there's some covert controlling mechanism controlling what kind of entertainment should be enjoyed by the people of Hong Kong through political censorship. So I'm fast forwarding, all these things gradually change. All this political censorship measure gradually put underground or exercised in a more covert manner, while MacLeod, when being the governor of Hong Kong, tried to overtly promote freedom of the speech and free press. Why? In his confidential memo to London, he said, we are facing critical period when I or the London government had to eventually negotiate with China about the return of Hong Kong. So therefore, the most important thing to do is to widen the gap of living standard between Hong Kong and China, to develop civic pride of the people of Hong Kong, to foster the belongings to the colonial government, to foster the sense of belonging to the colonial government. Therefore, he had to do things to increase the materialistic living standard as well as the civic pride among the people of Hong Kong. So that hopefully might improve our bargaining positions. What kind of bargaining positions? If you were a tenant, your lease is up, then you just leave, right? But actually, no. During the 70s, London government actually had three choices in their mind in this cabinet confidential minute, saying that they prioritize staying in Hong Kong beyond 1997. Okay, so they would like the Chinese government to amend the lease. That's the ideal solutions. Or, failing which, to secure their silence to allow the London government to stay beyond 1997. Failing both of which, orderly withdrawal in 1997. Therefore, they would like to, do something good in Hong Kong, so that they have the, more bargaining power to negotiate with later Deng Xiaoping. Hence, that's all behind the nicely remembered social reforms of MacLeod in the 70s. Housing reforms, social reforms, secondary education reforms, provisions of free educations. Not only this, less often reported is their information policy. So 70s is the first time that Hong Kong government publicly emphasized the importance of freedom of speech, publicly emphasized the role of media, and publicly promoted the free press. And unprecedentedly, Hong Kong government under MacLeod held the CPU, which is the Commonwealth Press Union's conference in Hong Kong, gathering journalists and editors in Hong Kong, emphasizing Hong Kong was a place in Asia that enjoys the best level of the free press. But despite that, all the laws I mentioned, although less often used, but was not abolished. So it was the first time in the 70s where we have press conference with government officials. This was the first time. But still, okay, into the 70s, if you look at the 70s histories in Hong Kong, there were still a lot of government crackdowns on the what we call the New Left movements, the Chinese language movements, and some other social protests that were cracked down by the Hong Kong government using the laws that I mentioned, but of course less often used. Until failing the negotiation with the Chinese government, Hong Kong had to be returned. Okay. After the signing of the joint declarations, all the laws, or most of the laws that I mentioned in Hong Kong in relation to political censorship of the Chinese press were lifted, abolished, substantially modified. In my book, I also did a rough count of the awakenings of human rights issues in Hong Kong in the 80s, where you found very few Hong Kong press reported or talked about human rights in Hong Kong in the 70s, 60s, whereas you found suddenly so many newspaper press were quote unquote allowed to talk about human rights and the importance of the rule of law in Hong Kong. Not to mention, after Tiananmen, Hong Kong was the first time being granted the freedom of speech in their statute book by the passing of the Bill of Rights Ordinance, which was already 1991. So with that, of course, there's some surprise. I'm not sure I should say it's a nice surprise or bad surprise in London that further accelerated the granting of rights or freedoms to the people of Hong Kong, such as the accidental stepping down of Margaret Thatcher. That led to the stepping down of their more moderate China advisors in their cabinets, and this governor in Hong Kong, who were also a part of what they call the China experts, who would like to discuss with China on things happening in Hong Kong, or measures to be carried in Hong Kong, unlike this gentleman, who seems to be not so much into discussing, okay? So, and of course, the stepping out of John Major. Without John Major, there's no Chris Patten. So those are the accidental incidences that further accelerated the lifting of censorship measures against journalists, against media, against TV in Hong Kong. For example, the bill was passed to scrap Teller's authority to censor public entertainment. Actually, in the past, the televisions and entertainment licensing authority had the right to censor even staging a performance. They had the right to censor the scripts of any performance in the public. Of course, we don't have this now because of the scrapping. Also, if you are studying TV, you should be very familiar with this TV code of practice on programming. So before Chris Patten, there's still a clause saying that something likely to be injurious to community well-being, morality, or in the public interest, but no one defined what public interest is, that could not be shown in TV. And this clause was deleted. So you're now having the deleted version, okay, as the post-colonial code of practice. So, of course, a lot more laws being lifted. So hence, going back to my argument, where did Hong Kong people's free press or freedom of speech come from? So it's not from the English legal system. It's not from the rule of law. It's not from common law. It's from how China was tackled, how global geopolitics evolved. Of course, that fit very well with Chris Patten's rhetoric of praising British contribution to Hong Kong by setting up a rule of law and free society, which he was very successful in building a colonial legacy that a lot of people believed, especially those who waved the flags. But to me, he's very successful in building up a colonial legacy by erasing the marks of colonialism. So if you want to know more, please buy the book. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was really illuminating. I think taking a step back from Hong Kong, what your argument reminds me of is, I guess, a very general principle that I've always suspected, that those with power don't voluntarily create conditions that would remove censorship and authoritarian rule unless they anticipate that they might lose power and be on the other side. This, of course, is a big reason why in liberal democracies with regular turnovers of government, it is in each party's own enlightened self-interest to preserve freedom of speech, because they know that they could be on the other side. Eventually, they won't always have those controls in their hands. And it sounds very much that that was the British colonial government's calculation as well. Since we won't have those powers anymore, we'd better make sure that those powers are dismantled in time for the handover, which is, so I love the way you have traced that history for us. And let me take questions and comments. Yes, Daya.
I think it can pick up. Yeah. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I have to make my biases very clear. I have a master's in history and I have a PhD in international relations. So I find that it is wonderful to hear this kind of historical context, which makes sense in contemporary situation in a very direct way, as my colleague Cherian just mentioned. So thank you for doing this, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. I have two questions. One is a sort of straightforward, basic question about the newspapers you were describing. What was the circulation of these? How important were they as a site for contestation or anti-colonial sentiments, etc.? But perhaps a more reflective question is about, in terms of geopolitics of it, that Hong Kong was also, until recently, a very important Western enclave for Western media. So if you think of Far Eastern Economic Review, Asia Week, every major Western outfit had their base here to essentially cover China. So so there is a kind of interesting contradiction. So at one level, you're restricting the domestic media, but you're also opening up to then show how freedom is actually curtailed in this big nasty neighbor next to you. And this is a very important aspect of the kind of media coverage of not just China actually, but the whole of the region. And there's also then this kind of whole covert communication. I mean, the Radio Free Asia, for instance, was based here. So do you touch on any of that? Because what I really liked about your presentation is this kind of geopolitical connection, going back all the way to the beginning of the century, last century. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. I'm glad that you like the book. Yes, I'm entirely with you. So Hong Kong history should be placed against, geopolitical historical context to understand fully. So going back to your two questions, number one, the circulations, I hope I remember correctly, it's been mentioned in the book. So in the 60s, the total circulations of left-wing newspapers is about 300,000 to 400,000 copies daily. So within the populations of less than 3 million or about 3 million, it's not a small circulation. So it occupied quite a big space in the newspaper market. Hence, the colonial government was anxious. The second question, even more important, how did they deal with English press? So in my book, I also documented a number of letters from the Hong Kong colonial government to South China Morning Post, asking them to report to Hong Kong government about certain incidents. Say, for example, Indian activities in Hong Kong, Japanese aggressions in China, etc. So, and also I documented a number of covert exchanges between colonial Hong Kong government and the press, in the English press, to advise, quote unquote, them what to report and what not to. So therefore, I think it's not a secret that during colonial times, SCMP was quite pro-government. Okay, so going even further to those Far Eastern economic reviews, those regional or international press, Hong Kong government was a little bit more cautious in terms of how to censor them or how to advise them or warn them, because one crucial factor for the Hong Kong colonial government in terms of whether to exercise draconian measure is MPs from London. If any of these medias have contact or way of pressuring London or pressuring MPs in London or triggering any debate or question in London, Hong Kong government was very nervous. Hence, LC2 made Hong Kong government nervous back into the 60s and 70s because LC2 had the line to London to trigger London's reactions or MPs' reactions, or especially the opposition party MPs in London. So I think there's a 3 layers of censorship Domestic, of course, most hardest draconians. SCMP's local English, they would use covert communications, paper communication without pre-vetting. For international press or regional press, they was more cautious, sometimes let them speak more. But I also came across incidents where editors of those press, regional press, were declined work visa in Hong Kong.
Other questions? Please.
Thank you so much, sir, for this insightful talk. I want to know, in 1997, there was also a wave of mass migration. So when you were looking for these archives, was there any mention or was there any relation that also you could find from censorship on press and mass migration of people?
I think number one, there was mass migration. Is a known fact. And number two, I didn't find the colonial government very nervous about the reports, but they were very nervous about the so-called the brain drains. So they try to use a lot of politics to 抢人才, okay, to grab talent, just like what we are seeing now, or attract them back. But the reports about the brain drain was not something that agitate the colonial government that much. Especially during 90s, the entire atmosphere was created so that people seem to be enjoying the free press so much, and the colonial government enjoy seeing people enjoying the free press.
A question that relates to your earlier point about other communities in Hong Kong. And of course, the British weren't the only imperialists in town, especially pre-war. And I know there's some documentation of how the European imperialists, while competitors at one level, were also sympathetic to their fellow imperialists' need to keep the natives at bay, right? So is there any evidence of cooperation between the British and, say, the Dutch or the French in policing anti-imperial, anti-colonial elements in freer cities like Hong Kong?
Thank you so much for these questions. Actually, as I just mentioned, I tried to place the books against international relations context. So there are imperial collaborations, but not so much from Dutch. The biggest collaborators is the US. So US kept communicating with the colonial Hong Kong government, trying to press the Hong Kong government to press harder to eradicate the leftist press, the leftist propaganda, the leftist trade unions in Hong Kong, while the colonial Hong Kong government tried to pull back, try not to do sometimes this hard because of state security issues, because they really fear that the People Liberation Army will cross the river and then, resume sovereignty in Hong Kong earlier, where foreign officers advised Hong Kong colonial government that the US has mentioned that they would not give military support in case of any aggressions. So therefore, Hong Kong government was basically walking along the very fine line within the international relations context between the pull and push force of London, US, and Hong Kong governments, three of which have different interests. Say, for example, for London, they might be more leaning towards collaborating with Washington, but sometimes colonial government did not want that. There are also instances before World War II where Japanese governments, as well as Singapore governments, also collaborated with Hong Kong governments in terms of how to deal with political dissents. Thanks very much.
That also reminds me of something that I did read in your book, which is that as I guess communism became less popular within Hong Kong, because there was, of course, a cultural change. What we think of as the leftist Chinese press remained anti-imperialism, but mainly directed against American imperialism rather than British. Would that be right?
Yes. Yes, actually, if you want to do research, I'm sure it would be very interesting research to trace the tone of leftist newspapers. So because the leftist is not something monolithic, as you mentioned, they have their presence in Hong Kong, very skillfully targeting their political target. During the 50s, during the height of Cold War, especially after the Korean Wars, so a lot of newspapers, headings of those newspapers targeted brutally in terms of words and tones against colonial Hong Kong government. Into the 60s, so especially after the riots, so a lot of the headlines are targeting broadly imperialism of European or sometimes US, not so much of local government, in order not to agitate the government to take action against them. And even more important, if you look at the 70s, the leftist newspapers is much less political. Because of what? So very important context at the beginning of 70s, ping-pong foreign policy. So Chinese, US establishing relationship, formal exchange of ambassadors between Britain and China, and China's accessions into the UN. So the entire 70s is a kind of peaceful, relatively peaceful coexistence, where you found less, aggressive headlines from those newspapers.
So less ideological.
Less ideological. They place more focuses on horse racing, entertainment, television dramas, entertainment news, crimes, of course, rather than politically targeting the colonial government during that period of time. So which Magley Host enjoyed. Thanks very much.
Maybe to end with, if you could share with us where, I mean, this was a long journey, I'm sure, with the book, but are there pieces of it that you're still investigating? What's next on your research agenda? Or have you moved on to something totally different?
I'm working on another project which is correlated, but less so much on the press or freedom expressions. I'm trying to look at the roles of courts and judges vis-a-vis their colonial roles. So, but there's very preliminary projects. But if for those of you who are interested in furthering, the things that I've just mentioned, actually I've left out a lot of things, given I cannot have a fat book to be published. So I found a lot of interesting things about censoring in terms of right of assembly, protest, as well as in education sectors and education materials, how teachers, principals, textbooks were dealt with. If you go to the Kwun Tong's Hong Kong Public Records Office and then type in communist schools, you have tons of files for multiple PhD projects. I highly encourage students to look at censorship measures beyond the media.
Wonderful. Those sound like very promising research questions that I hope people will pick up. So with that, I want to thank our guest Michael for a wonderful, illuminating talk on censorship during a period that is not talked about much. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you.